Hello, everyone. Dr. Brian Felix is the chair of the Department of Music at UNC Asheville. He has studied at Rutgers College and DePaul University and has a DMA in jazz performance from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Urbana.
If you're in the Midwest, it's Urbana.
Sorry. His research interests include jazz and improvised musics, the Grateful Dead, and the Beatles. His work has been published in Jazz Perspectives, and he is the co-author of Interactive Listening, A New Approach to Music. He is also a professional keyboardist. He was the co-leader of Trio, an acclaimed jazz rock group that toured internationally between 1999 and 2004. He teaches classes on jazz theory, improvisation, jazz history, keyboard skills, music business, the Beatles, and the Grateful Dead. And he's also a really nice guy. So I think you're going to enjoy this lecture on Beethoven the Improviser. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Virginia. Thanks everybody for being here. Look forward to getting into this presentation here. I'm gonna share it or get it started so that I can not worry about that.
Is that your iPhone that's on?
Okay. Okay, and so can you all see my screen right now? You see this share? Okay, cool. And then can you see me in like a little box or something like that? All right, that's good. Perfect. Okay, so thanks all for being here. This presentation is something of an encore performance, I guess, of a presentation that I did in late January 2020. So right before COVID hit, we had no idea what was going to happen. It was one of the last times that I had a presentation where there were a bunch of people in the room. It was packed Laurel Forum on UNC Asheville campus. And honestly thrilled to be asked to present this information again, because I don't know, I kind of going back through it again this time. This research is fun. It's really fun to talk about. And I hope you enjoy. So I'm just gonna get into it here. So in the first half of the 19th century, the ability to improvise was an essential component of every pianist's skill set. Indeed, the growing middle-class audience craved the spontaneous individual expression that only improvisation could bring. And the lions of the keyboard obliged by including at least one improvisation in each of their concert programs. By the 1840s, however, improvisation became increasingly out of fashion. The musical work became the object of import, and the ink of the genius composer's pen was not to be altered in any way. Also, as more amateurs began playing pianos in their homes, composers became less inclined to leave their works open to interpretation. Thus, both the public and composers became wary of improvisation, which led to its remarkable disappearance from the world of Western art music. Beethoven was at the center of this improvisational world, both in its popularity and decline. It is a foregone conclusion that he was a miraculous improviser. The oft-quoted story of Beethoven's encounter with Steitbelt, during which Beethoven improvised brilliantly on a theme poked out from an upside-down cello part, is just one of the many accounts of Beethoven's genius extemporizations. It has also been suggested that Beethoven may have preferred to improvise over playing his own compositions. According to musicologist and concert pianist William Kinderman, it is noteworthy that during his long years as a piano virtuoso, Beethoven was disinclined to play his published works and preferred to extemporize. Beethoven's student Ferdinand Ries reported that when they made preparations for a tour together, he was to have played Beethoven's concertos and other finished compositions, whereas Beethoven wanted only to conduct and improvise. With the evidence we have today, it's safe to say that nearly all musical cultures either contain or have contained some aspect of improvisation. In the Western art music tradition, evidence of improvisation exists back into the Middle Ages and probably further, when singers learned to improvise a melodic line over another fixed melodic line or cantus firmus. Figured bass notation, which was common practice in the Baroque and early classical eras, involved a bass line and chord symbols, using which a keyboardist would improvise an accompaniment. Not all that dissimilar to the way a jazz pianist might use a lead sheet today. Indeed, significant improvisational practices persisted from the Middle Ages through the Renaissance, Baroque, and classical eras into Beethoven's time, which straddled the late classical and early Romantic periods. So Beethoven inherited this tradition from his predecessors, Bach and Mozart, to name just two, were masterful improvisers, and he certainly influenced the following generation of prominent pianist composers. Chopin comes to mind, who similarly studied the art of improvisation and extemporized frequently in concert. To many of you, it may come as a shock that Beethoven was an improviser. It cannot be. Indeed, it may run contrary to everything you've ever thought about Beethoven in particular and classical music in general. The reality is that Beethoven dedicated countless hours towards the development of his improvisational abilities, which were central to his success as a working musician. While he was making a name for himself in Vienna during the 1790s, it was his skill as an improviser, not as a composer, for which he first garnered acclaim. And of course, later he did garner acclaim for his compositions as well. Beethoven biographer Jan Stafford relates an instance from 1793 in which Abbe Joseph Gelinek, a leading piano virtuoso in Vienna, evidently engaged in a piano duel with the young Beethoven. The day following the duel, Gelinek commented, "Yesterday was the day I'll remember. That young fellow must be in league with the devil. I've never heard anybody play like that. I gave him a theme to improvise on, and I assure you, I've never even heard Mozart improvise so admirably." Unfortunately for modern listeners, there was no audio recording technology in Beethoven's time, so we cannot hear what he actually sounded like while improvising. Scholars agree that there was a close link between Beethoven's improvisations and compositions, with the latter often representing a crystallized version of the former. In particular, his 5 piano concertos provide clues as to Beethoven's improvisational practice, as those pieces were intended to showcase the virtuosity and extemporizations of the soloist, who was, for the first 4 concertos, Beethoven himself. Later in this talk, I will use his piano concertos, the 4th in particular, to illustrate what Beethoven may have sounded like while improvising. First, though, I'll provide a bit more historical backdrop that will help to contextualize Beethoven's accomplishments in the appropriate place and time. Cool, that worked. The late 18th and early 19th century Vienna, in which Beethoven operated for the majority of his professional life, was one of the music centers of Europe. Typically, musicians performed in courts for their wealthy patrons. While subscription concerts did exist, they were not nearly as common as they would become a few decades later. Under this system of court patronage, musical practices were passed down, often orally, from one generation to the next, often to members of the same family. Compositions weren't always strictly notated, and it was assumed that there would be a certain amount of improvisation involved in performance. As Clive Brown notes in Classical and Romantic Performing Practice, it was the composer's duty to provide solo performers with an outline on which they could elaborate in a manner that displayed their own abilities. And that where notated ornaments were included by the composer, it was commonly taken for granted that performers were fully at liberty to substitute others that might suit them better. In this context, it can be said that music making was left to the experts who would know how to properly improvise in the context of a particular piece. As the 19th century progressed, the primary market for music consumption shifted from the courts to the middle class. This new bourgeoisie became the largest segment of music consumers and performers. There was a rise in piano production, which gave a new generation of amateurs the opportunity to perform in their own living rooms. As the distribution of sheet music increased, because there were more and more people playing it on their own at their homes, so did the trend for composers to be increasingly specific in their notation. Previously, it would seem a composer could trust the performer to improvise appropriately because he or she was playing the piece himself, herself, or he or she had personally trained the musician. Now that the potential performers were by and large less skilled than in previous generations, it became necessary for notations to be specific. The elevation of the musical work, or the work true, as Lydia Gare would call it, created a newfound worshiping of the composer as genius. With this reverence for the composer's pen, the new interpreters of music became much less likely to improvise. This aspect of Gare's assertion rings true, however, the timeline is off. Her assertion that improvisation was no longer approximate to the condition of composition proper in the early 19th century is, by most barometers, false. Newer research on the subject shows that not only was the practice of improvisation alive and well in the first decades of the 19th century, but it played a central role for both performers and public. There were three types of improvisation at work in the late 18th century, embellishment, cadenza, and free fantasy. Embellishment, which can be looked at as the ornamentation or modification of a composed melodic line, varied in degree between performers. Composers of the period notated specific ornaments for novices, but it was fully expected that more experienced performers would improvise their own embellishments. The cadenza was a longer type of improvisation to be executed at an extended pause in the music. Usually, these pauses were marked by the composer's inscription cadenza ad libitum or with a fermata. Often recommended cadenzas were written out, but it was understood that the performer could alter or extend it according to good taste. The free fantasy was an improvised introduction to a larger work and later became known as the prelude. It could range in length from extremely short, only a few chords, to a much longer and more involved piece, including themes from the work that would be subsequently performed. Theoreticians of the time, from C.P.E. Bach in the 18th century to Czerny in the 19th century, seem to agree that successful improvisation of this type was based on solid knowledge of progressions and consistency of harmonic rhythm. Indeed, through study and preparation in the realms of harmony and melody, were prerequisites for thorough study and preparation in the realms of harmony and melody were prerequisites for all types of improvisation. This brief summary of late 18th century improvisational styles provides a backdrop for the 19th century musical landscape in which the ability to improvise was expected of any decent performer. The absence of recordings from this period hampers our ability to ascertain the exact nature of these improvisations. But fortunately, Czerny gave the matter a detailed treatment in his A Systematic Introduction to Improvisation on the Pianoforte, originally published in 1829, Opus 200. He includes detailed sections on how one can prepare to improvise many types of pieces and gives particular attention to the longer forms, such as the prelude and theme and variations. Let's see if I click what happens. Oh, there we go. There he is. Czerny notes, it is akin to a crown of distinction for a keyboardist, particularly in private circles at the performance of solo works, if he does not begin directly with the composition itself, but is capable by means of a suitable prelude of preparing the listener, setting the mood, and also hereby ascertaining the qualities of the pianoforte, perhaps unfamiliar to him in appropriate fashion. This then begs the question, what did Beethoven sound like when he improvised? There is no doubt that we can look at the body of Beethoven's composed music for ideas. Certainly his composed ideas and improvised ideas were similar in ways, and it is certain that some of his compositions were born out of themes that were originally improvised. But the question remains, how did his improvisations differ from his composed works? In order to begin answering these questions, I will look at one of the genres that contained a large amount of improvisation by the pianist and composer, the piano concerto. Musicologist Leon Plantinga notes that it was in the concerto that he offered the audience its fullest view of the composer's individuality and gift. Here, together with the attractions of the music, was the exhilaration of virtuosity and, given the improvisational nature of the solo part, even a glimpse of the composer seemingly in the very act of creation. A concerto is a piece of music. You all know this, but I'm going to say it anyway. A concerto is a piece of music written for soloist or small group with orchestra, and typically has 3 movements: fast, slow, fast. Mozart did much to popularize the genre in the 18th century, and it is in Mozart's footsteps that Beethoven followed. Beethoven wrote 5 piano concertos that were eventually published, and they all follow the classical model of 3 movements: fast, slow, fast. I just need to adjust my screen here, and that's fine. The first piano concerto he composed, which would ironically be published as the Piano Concerto No. 2, in B flat major, opus 19, was begun in 1788. The so-called Emperor Piano Concerto number 5 in E flat major, opus 73, was completed in 1809. This 21-year span, 1788 to 1809, marks the years where Beethoven was very much interested in his career as a performing pianist, and the concertos became an important vehicle for his virtuosity. This was not unusual for pianist composers. Plantinga notes that for Beethoven, as for J.C. Bach, Mozart, and Clementi before him, and Hummel, Moscheles, and Liszt after him, the concerto was mainly a personal vehicle for the composer virtuoso's performances, a means for displaying new musical ideas of which a central feature was his own distinctive style of playing. Here are some important things to know about Beethoven's piano concertos. They were composed by Beethoven to showcase himself as a performer, and he was the pianist at the premiere of the first 4. By 1811, Beethoven was no longer able to perform due to his hearing loss, and another pianist gave the premiere of his concerto number 5 on November 28th of that year. This marks the first time that Beethoven did not present the first performance of one of his piano concertos, and also symbolically marks the end of his interest in the genre. Interestingly, the composer attempted to write another piano concerto in 1815, but the project was abandoned before the first movement was complete. It seems that by that year, now unable to perform the piece himself, Beethoven's attempt at a concerto was an exercise in looking backwards, and thus failed to keep the composer's interest sufficiently for even one movement to be complete. He often delayed publication so that he could revise. Because the piano concertos were specifically written for his own performance, Beethoven employed different composing and publishing strategies than he did with many of his other large-scale works. Evidently, Beethoven wanted to avoid fixing the text so that he could continually revise the piece. Indeed, this is supported by the fact that there is often an inordinate amount of time between the composition and publication for his concertos, particularly the first 2. There we go. Oh, yeah, bummer. There we go. Particularly the first 2. The times elapsed between the beginning of composition and first publication are as follows. Opus 15, 6 years. Opus 19, 13 years. Opus 37, 4 years. Opus 58, 4 years. Opus 73, 1 year. It would seem that Opus 73 doesn't fit the pattern of the previous 4 concertos because Beethoven wasn't performing the piece and thus had no interest in delaying publication for further revision. More here on the concertos. According to Plantinga, the primary destination of Beethoven's sonatas was clearly publication. Of his symphonies, performance to be followed as soon as possible by publication. These compositions, therefore, soon acquired texts. But for the concertos, the performance itself was at the very heart of his intention, particularly while focused upon making his name in Vienna as a public performer. Beethoven, like Mozart before him, was in no hurry to publish these pieces. He held them back, as he once said, to allow for subsequent revision. Publication in the interim would dull the glimmer of novelty and, perhaps more important, fix the text in a way that Beethoven evidently wished to avoid. Another reason for delay in publication was that Beethoven didn't have a confirmed piano part for performance and was thus improvising portions of it, which leads to a third important point. His piano parts were often sketched. In none of these 3 cases, regarding the first 3 concertos, Plantinga notes that in none of these 3 cases did he bother to get the piano part firmly written down before the performance. The orchestra needed an exacting script, but his own part of the dialogue was always to a large extent extemporaneous and hence ever variable. Indeed, Beethoven used these pieces as the ultimate vehicle for the improvising pianist composer. He was free to alter his part spontaneously in performance, unbound by specific notation. A colorful comment on Beethoven's practice for performing his concertos came from Ignaz Seyfried, who was tasked as page turner for a performance of Beethoven's C minor piano concerto number 3 in 1803. In the playing of the concerto, he asked me to turn the pages for him, but heaven help, that was easier said than done. I saw almost nothing but empty leaves. At the most, A few Egyptian hieroglyphs, wholly unintelligible to me, scribbled down to serve as clues for him, for he played nearly all of the solo part from memory. He gave me a secret glance whenever he was at the end of one of the invisible passages, and my scarcely concealable anxiety not to miss the decisive moment amused him greatly, and he laughed heartily at the jovial supper, which we ate afterwards. I just love that. All right. Even when looking at the published versions of the concertos, Beethoven's penchant for capturing an improvisational style has often been noted by scholars. The opening passage of the fourth concerto, Opus 58, for example, with its unusual revelation of the soloist in the first bar, resembles improvisation in both pacing and character. It is as if the pianist, in non-response to the orchestra, is trying out an idea that we imagine could have taken many forms. So I am going to start playing some music here. So if somebody can just give me a thumbs up to make sure everything is sounding okay on your end on Zoom, that'd be great. Let's see, I was going to say one more thing here. It's important to note that that the convention at the time was to have the orchestra introduce at least two of the main themes before the piano entrance. Here in his fourth concerto, Beethoven is breaking that rule by having the piano begin the piece. So we're listening to the improvisational quality of music here. So what does it mean for music to sound improvised if it's written? I don't know. Let's try to figure it out. But what I'm focusing on here are passages in Beethoven's concertos that other scholars have pointed out as sounding improvised. So here we go. I'm just going to hope that it works. And I'm going to look at yours. Just give me a thumbs up if you hear. This is the beginning of Piano Concerto number 4, Opus 58. Okay, good. Thanks. Okay. In his first concerto, the entrance of the soloist into the piece, bar 106, also resembles improvisation. At this juncture, the orchestra has completed a powerful 2D exposition, and the piano enters with a timid secondary theme. The nature of the passage is akin to a shy, quote, a shy character who really doesn't want to come on stage at first. And that's from William Kinderman. It is not until bar 118 that the pianist builds up enough momentum for the orchestra to rejoin the proceedings with the opening theme. The contrasting nature of the solo passage suggests that Beethoven approached this section as in an improvisatory way. One can imagine Beethoven entering into the piece with a short extemporaneous escapade in which only the character of the passage was predetermined. And if we know that he didn't have it written down anyway, so yeah. What's that? Yeah. Indeed, if he was performing without a fixed piano part, it is likely that he was at least partially improvising the section. Thus, the published version represents what Beethoven thought would ultimately convey the desired mood. But this part was likely improvised many times before he settled on a final text. Here's the example, and I've included the orchestral part immediately preceding the piano entrance to give you an idea of the contrasting character. Listen for the piano entrance here. And again, we're listening for this piano entrance to sound like, quote, a shy character who really doesn't want to come on stage at first. So we're here the orchestra and then the piano. even at the end, they're still kind of doing that little shy, little grace note thing, if that's how you read it. But yeah, to me, that's convincing. Okay. In order to look more closely at the nature of Beethoven's improvisations, I will now look at his written cadenzas, which represent textual crystallizations that occurred after many years of improvised concerto performance. According to late 18th and early 19th century performance practice, a fermata placed over the tonic 6/4 chord toward the end of a movement meant that the performer was to improvise a passage that would eventually lead the orchestra back in for the closing tutti. The manifestation of this took on many forms since the term cadenza first appeared around 1500. One interesting example that predated Beethoven is from Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 3 in G major. In this 3-movement work, the entire second movement was originally an improvised section, the entire movement. It is notated as such on the original score. This fermata with what is called a Phrygian half cadence signaled to the performer that it was time to improvise. Indeed, every version that I listened to had something completely different in that spot. I chose this particular version because this really sounds like an improvised section for harpsichord. I'll play the end of the first movement, the improvised second movement, and the beginning of the third movement so you can hear it. So I got to jump out of this here. Let me see if this will work. All right, here. So this is the second movement here. That's the whole movement. And that's the third movement. Okay, yeah, I've heard other ones that are longer and that sort of thing, but that one, I don't know if they can see my cursor. So like, I don't know if they can see. Oh, they can see that. Okay, cool. Yeah, so this whole thing right here, this is this, you see the double bar lines here in the fermatas. This is the whole second movement. And it was just wide open for whatever to happen in there. And so you have a wide variety of things on different recordings that I've listened to of this. Sometimes they insert, people insert entire other pieces, other movements of other pieces in the middle because they're not sure what to do. It's also interesting because this is a very famous, I mean, you know this piece, right? This is a very famous one, but in actuality, that entire second movement was just this improvised section. Okay. This next example, let me make sure I said everything I need to say. I think I did. All right. The next example comes later in the 18th century and is from Haydn's String Quartet Opus 9, number 4 in D minor, composed in 1769. Although this isn't from a concerto, this particular cadenza behaves in a way that is similar to the classical concerto cadenzas that Beethoven inherited. This sort of cadenza was common in the slow movements of Haydn's string quartets. What you see here is the movement coming to a close. So yeah, the part that I have, yeah, it's coming to a close. It's not ending, but it's coming to a close there, the part that's like circled in red. Coming to a close and the instrumental voices settling on a partial tonic 6/4 chord. In this case, it's 3 Fs and a B flat. And then as convention dictated, the first violin did a little improvisation that then led back into the tonic key of B flat and the close of the movement. So let's have a listen to this. Okay, And I think this is going to give it to us. And I'm going to skip to here. It's a nice recording of that too. Yeah, so the point there, it's not very long, right? But you get the idea that there's this spot that's left open for somebody to kind of do a little improvising. So Beethoven obviously expanded that quite a bit. Well, but Mozart did first. So let's do that. So my final pre-Beethoven contextual example is from Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 5 in D major. Composed only 4 years after the Haydn example we just heard. The purpose here is to reinforce how and where the cadenza functions. As with Beethoven, Mozart performed most, if not all, of his piano concertos himself. And through the cadenzas, we can envision the virtuosic Mozart in live performance. You note here the familiar fermata, the trill, and then the re-entry of the orchestra. So I'm going to get this from here again. And I think I'm going to put it here. Okay, so we're still in the piece here. We got about 15 seconds and then we're going to get the cadenza. But yeah, there you have that. So that's really the style of cadenza that Beethoven inherited. All right. So by 1789, the cadenza was evidently in crisis, which led German theorist and composer G.G. Turk to publish 10 rules of cadenza performance in his Klavierschule. Turk's efforts were evidently an attempt to keep a piece from being cadenza'd away by soloists who were prone to exercising bad taste, and that is a quote. The rules read as follows, and there's a bunch here, but they are interesting, so we're just going to go through them. The cadenza should reinforce the impression made by the composition by providing a brief summary of it. This may be achieved by weaving some of the important ideas from the piece into the cadenza. The cadenza should not be difficult for its own sake, but rather contain thoughts that are suited to the main character of the composition. The cadenza should not be too long, especially in sad compositions. I love that. The modulation should be avoided or used only in passing, and should never stray beyond the main keys established in the piece. That's interesting. The cadenza, in addition to expressing a unified sentiment, must have some musical variety to maintain the listener's interest. Ideas should not be repeated either in the same key or in different keys. Dissonances, even in single-voiced cadenzas, must be properly resolved. A cadenza need not be learnt, but should show novelty, wit, and an abundance of ideas. Number 9, in a cadenza, the performer should not stay in one tempo or meter too long, but should give the impression of ordered disorder. Cadenza may be usefully compared to a dream in which events that have been compressed into the space of a few minutes make an impression, yet lack coherence and clear consciousness. A cadenza should be performed as though it had just occurred to the performer. Nevertheless, it is risky to improvise a cadenza on the spot and much safer to write it down or at least sketch it in advance. Turk's rules are important for several reasons. His treatise coincides chronologically with the time that Mozart was performing and composing cadenzas and can thus serve as a blueprint for creating Mozartian elaborations for the pieces that have no surviving cadenza manuscript, which is most of them or all of them, I think. Turk also provides a time frame for understanding when certain developments occurred. For example, his rule number 10 clearly delineates that in the late 18th century, there was already a concern for fixing the cadenza text, a process that would become standard in decades to come. Lastly, the rules provide a clear elucidation of the cadenza style that Beethoven inherited from Mozart. By understanding Turk's angle, we can isolate the ways in which Beethoven both adhered to and repudiated the rules of the past. In 1829, Carl Czerny extended Turk's ideas on cadenza performance in his A Systematic Introduction to Improvisation on the Pianoforte. Note that this was published shortly after Beethoven's death. Since Czerny was a student of Beethoven's, it is reliable to think that Czerny's pedagogical method of teaching improvisation was influenced by Beethoven's tutelage. In the chapter concerning cadenzas, fermatas, and more extended elaborations, here it is. Czerny first stresses that performing a successful cadenza is largely a process of employing good taste. This is sort of what appears to be elusive at the time, good taste, right? I don't know, I'm not sure what was going on exactly. Furthermore, he underlines that the performer must be steeped in the aesthetics of a particular piece in order to improvise a successful cadenza. Naturally, only the more cultivated taste and broad experience of the performer can determine their suitable application. In works of profound content and serious character, for example, Beethoven's Sonata D minor, opus 29, employing any kind of additional material would be very ill-advised. After making it clear that the performer must exercise the utmost in taste and discretion, Czerny lays out several rules that govern cadenza-like improvisation. So again, this is like 30 years or so after that last example. So it's 30 or 40 years actually. And so now these are the things that Czerny thinks he needs to build on those other rules that we just saw. The cadenza must be fully compatible with the content and spirit of the piece in general, as with the preceding and subsequent material in particular. Therefore, following an energetic delivery, similarly brilliant passage work should be introduced. On the other hand, gentle material should be followed by correspondingly light and delicate elaborations. The cadenza must be neither too long nor too rhapsodic, so as not to impede the continuity and momentum of the whole. The performer may modulate neither into the keys nor into remote harmonies, but must always retain the chord prolongation as the underlying harmony. He must enter into the following subject with melodic propriety and in a manner that is pleasing and suitable, for the most part occurs by means of diminuendo and rallentando into the tempo di adagio. Should the subsequent theme be of a lively and dynamic nature, then the transition can also at times be accomplished through a lively passage, crescendo and accelerando. Czerny continues by elucidating a set of alternate rules to govern the closing cadenza for concertos. I think I talk about this. I'll talk about this later. The older concertos, for example, all of Mozart's, most of Beethoven's, etc., have a prolonged pause towards the end of the closing of the last tutti. And I'll say it right now. Closing cadenza is a confusing term. They're talking about the first movement. They're talking about the cadenza that closes the first movement. That's what they're talking about. It seems like it's, maybe if it's closing, it's at the end of the third movement. It's not. They're talking about the one that's at the end of the first movement. These concerto cadenzas, by virtue of their necessary structure, are akin to a particularly distinctive form of fantasy. They can be extended considerably, and the performer can indulge in all conceivable modulations therein. but all interesting subjects from the concerto, as well as its most brilliant passages, must make their appearance here, although one can tone them down or build them up according to one's discretion. Since these cadenzas can be regarded to some extent as independent fantasies, and since the performer can display his artistry here a good deal more than in the concerto itself, it is thus to his great advantage to assimilate this style with particular diligence and to learn to improvise such cadenzas for all concertos of this type. Whereas Czerny's two rules of cadenza performance are at odds with each other. One forbids modulations, the other calls for them. It is important to mention that the latter elaboration concerning closing cadenzas is most relevant to the analysis of Beethoven's first movement cadenzas, and I just sort of talk about this. The use of closing cadenza to refer to the end of a first movement is clear because the example Czerny uses to illustrate this point is intended for Beethoven's Opus 15 first movement. I'm going to move on here. Thus, Czerny's first set of rules in its treatment of thematic material, modulation, and temperament largely agrees with Turk's treatise. These both present an approach that is largely Mozartian in style. It is Czerny's section on the closing cadenza that departs from the classical mold. In his specification that the performer can indulge in all conceivable modulations therein, and that the cadenza will represent more of an independent fantasy, Czerny inserts Beethoven's personality into the mix. As we will see in the coming analyses of Beethoven's first movement cadenzas, radical departures from tradition such as these are the trademark of the composer's approach to writing cadenzas. As mentioned earlier, Beethoven was the featured soloist in all of his piano concertos up through 1808. When his hearing became so poor that he can no longer effectively perform, Beethoven yielded the performance duties and thus a large amount of control. In order to maintain the maximum amount of influence over the end product, Beethoven decided to fix the solo part in the score. This included specific notation of the cadenzas, which prior to that time had been improvised in performance by the composer himself. In 1809, Beethoven composed what is now referred to as a canonical set of cadenzas for use with his 4 previously published piano concertos. In certain cases, he composed multiple cadenzas for the same concerto movement. In the cases of the first 3 concertos, the style that Beethoven employed in the cadenzas was much different than that of the work surrounding it. According to Plantinga, this music shows no interest in the niceties of historical verisimilitude. It is written in the more expansive and complex manner of 1809 and for the pianos of that time. So, side note, pianos and pianofortes were a relatively new invention that replaced the harpsichord around the turn of the 19th century in Beethoven's time. As the popularity rose, the technology developed quickly. Think about how quick cell phone technology has developed over the last 15 years. Although likely not as rapid, this can give you an idea of why Plantinga says that the pianos of 1809 were far different than the pianos from 20 years earlier. The cadenza that Beethoven composed for the 4th concerto was more stylistically akin with the music surrounding it. In fact, evidence points to the fact that the longer and most commonly performed cadenza for the first movement of this piece was similar to Beethoven's improvised cadenza at the premiere of December 22, 1808. The cadenza for the cadenza for the Emperor Concerto was written directly into the score, as I mentioned earlier, at the time of publication.
I just needed that.
So this right here, okay, what I have here on this slide, this is from the last piano concerto, the one that he didn't perform himself. And as you can see here, this is the concerto. I want to go over there, but I need to do it here. You can see here, this is actually the cadenza written into the score in the 5th concerto, because he wasn't performing it himself. And so he was like, well, I'm just gonna write it out so that whoever performs it plays it the way that I would want them to if I was performing. So by looking at his written cadenzas, we can get a glimpse of Beethoven's improvisational strategy and organizational logic. The general points I make here are threefold, and we'll go into each of these in some depth. Oops, that didn't work. Here we go. Beethoven uses thematic material from the movement, usually beginning with the first theme or the opening gesture of the first theme. 2, the harmonic motion is adventurous, often more so than in the main body of the movement. And 3, Beethoven plays with audience expectations in the final trill area. Okay, so here we have our example. So I'm going to spend most of the time here talking about, or most of the examples, excuse me, are going to come from his fourth piano concerto, Opus 58. And so the idea here with this slide and these examples is to demonstrate that in the cadenzas, which I am asserting that represent Beethoven's improvisational style, he pulls themes from the movement and manipulates them and utilizes them. So the cadenza's themes are related to the themes from the movement in which it resides. So here's the first theme that I'm calling a theme A here. So you get the distinct quality of that theme. So that's how the entire piece opens. So now here is the first. There are two cadenzas that he composed for this piece. This is the beginning of the first cadenza. So you can hear he's really playing, very clearly playing with that opening theme from the movement. And then, yes, and he should change the time signature as well, just for fun. So yes, for those of you that are on Zoom, Virginia just pointed out that it's in 6/8. So it is noteworthy here that the first cadenza that he composed is in 6/8, but the second cadenza he wrote is in 4/4. So for whatever reason. But here's the second cadenza that he composed as an option. He composed these different cadenzas as option for the performers who he was concerned would exercise bad taste if they were not told what to do. And so this is the opening of the second one. Again, you can see here that it uses this, it at least starts briefly with dot, 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 that, going with that gesture, but it goes away from it very quickly. He's using there too. And he's off. Okay, so we'll talk more about that in a minute here. So here, what we're looking at is also, okay, so now we're looking at the third theme C. So this is what I'm referring to as theme C because this is sort of what other analysts have called it. So here's the theme in the movement. It occurs sort of in the middle, and here's the sound of this theme. He certainly has a knack for writing catchy melodies, doesn't he? That Beethoven. All right, it's just remarkable. So there's keep that theme in your head. Da 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 do ba 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 do ba da. So that's how it presented itself in the movement. Here's how it presents itself in the first cadenza. This is occurring mid cadenza. Okay, so I think that's pretty clear there as well. I just wanted to point this out, that there's I'm calling a missing theme. Theme B doesn't appear in either of the cadenzas, in either of them, which is noteworthy. Maybe it was too contrasting, too militaristic. I'm mentioning this because in the treatises that we looked at, it was stated that all of the themes needed to make an appearance in the cadenzas. And so, but Beethoven didn't do it. He decided not to have this one. This is the theme that he decided not to have, at least in its straightforward form. So there's that theme. Oh, here I have Czerny. He's popping up just to remind us of what we should do if we had good taste. All interesting subjects from the concerto as well as its most brilliant passages must make their appearance here. So Beethoven didn't do that. There's this other theme that does make an appearance in the movement proper that may be related to that same thing, that theme that we just heard. Da 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 da. So this one may be related to that, possibly. Let's hear it. Sorry. No, go back. Come on. There we go. So there's that theme that appears called the Dolce theme. And then here it is in that was in the movement. Here it is in the cadenza. We'll listen, and we are going to listen to the whole cadenzas just so you can hear them. Oh, well, here they are. I'm going to play the two cadenzas for Piano Concerto number 4 in their entirety. I'll utilize this flow chart to walk you through the thematic development. And so I'm going to talk you through it, and then I'm going to play it, and I'll kind of try to use my cursor to give you roughly what I'm talking about. In the first cadenza, Beethoven begins with the first theme, theme A, on the tonic note of G in 6/8 time. The eighth notes then propel through a series of passing keys before the rhythmic drive dissolves into a series of dominant elaborations, first on C and then on F, which leads to the first statement of theme C and B flat major. This general section is based on theme C throughout and maintains its contrasting character and key until it dissolves into connecting material that then a new iteration of theme A at bar 37. Theme A now appears in D major and is once again quite aggressive. The eighth note motive gives way to an extended and frantic elaboration that finally gives way to the key of A flat major in bar 82. I know you don't have the bars in front of you, but with the contrasting Dolce theme, I guess that's what we could do. We could hand out the cadenzas. That's okay. Starting at this point, there is a struggle for dominance between the Dolce theme and the more aggressive theme A that lasts through the end of the cadenza. In bar 86, theme A resurges on a D7 chord only to be overtaken by the Dolce theme in G minor 2 bars later. Here, the Dolce theme is allowed to continue until it dissolves into arpeggios that eventually give way to the final trill and re-entry of the orchestra. I'll talk more about the revolutionary nature of the orchestral re-entry later, but it is necessary to say that at this point, the thematic content immediately post-cadenza is derived from the Dolce theme. In this sense, the more docile motive wins the battle of the cadenza. And so, yeah, you can see it, and I think you should be able to hear it, the battle between the da 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 and the da da do da. Those two themes are kind of battling it out, and in the end, the piano wins, which is playing the more gentle theme. Piano always wins, right? This is the piano form. Okay, here we go. So this is the first cadenza he wrote in its entirety. Oh, come on. So my computer is running out of batteries. Sorry, I'm going to start this again. Technical potential issue here. Oh, but that doesn't go in there.
Oh, really?
But do you need to plug in that?
No.
You would think that it would. I think maybe because I'm just running so many things right now.
Yes, we're the being.
That's the sound I wanted. All right. Okay, so let's get back into this. Sorry for that delay, but crisis avoided thanks to Marilyn. Okay, so we're going to go through this first cadenza here and listen specifically for the themes. And I think I made, even when I went back through this, and I knew that I was talking to all pianists today who could read all the music, I think I decided to just have you listen for the themes as opposed to trying to read the whole thing. I don't know, listen for like sort of bigger picture as opposed to trying to parse the score. Here we go. Is that beautiful? It's just beautiful. So there's that. So hopefully you can hear the themes. I think it's really clear. And so this is a kind of comprehensive attempt by Beethoven to address these themes that are in this first movement. So Beethoven takes a strikingly different approach in the second cadenza for the first movement of Opus 58. The first difference is evident even before a note is played. If you're looking at the score, this cadenza is in 4/4 as opposed to 6/8, which we mentioned. Theme A is once again used as the model for the opening motive, and the composer uses it quickly to drive him into the remote key of A flat major, and then just as quickly into C minor. This gives way to a fantasy-like section that can be seen as connecting material. In bar 22, theme A resurges in D flat major, but quickly gives away to another episode, this time in A major. The section leads into an overt statement of theme A, but this time in the minor mode, A minor. This gives way to a final episodic section that leads into the final trill area, which is a wash in references to the A theme. The overall length is approximately half of the first cadenza. So now let's listen to this one, which is going to sound very different. In comparing the two cadenzas Beethoven composed for the first movement of Opus 58, we can see two very different possibilities in Beethoven's thematic usage. Both cadenzas use theme A starting on the tonic G as the first theme, but the similarities end there. In the first, which is more commonly played, I can see why, I think, which is more commonly played, Beethoven moves carefully through three distinct themes from the movement. The second cadenza is more of a fantasy on a single theme. Theme A is the only excerpt from the movement that is evident in the cadenza. On this chart, I've isolated the large-scale harmonic motion of Opus 58's first movement in both cadenzas. The capital means major, lowercase means minor, parentheses means sort of. No, parentheses means there's an allusion to that key, but maybe not a full blown tonicization. It is clear from a cursory glance that all three have adventurous harmonic movement. Also, it is noteworthy that Beethoven uses keys in the cadenza that he doesn't visit in the movement. So you can see up here the keys that he uses in the movement, but then there are other ones down here that in the first cadenza, the composer moves to the Neapolitan key of A flat major in bar 82 before moving into the tonic parallel minor, G minor, for the remainder of the cadenza. It seems that Beethoven made a strong effort to fool the audience into thinking that the cadenza was actually going to end in G minor. It is only when the B natural is added towards the end of the final trill that the tonic key of G major returns. And I'm going to focus on that in just a second here. In the second cadenza, Beethoven seems radically bent on visiting remote keys. By the second bar, he's already driving toward the Neapolitan key of A flat major, which is followed quickly by C minor. The striking appearance of F sharp minor in bar 37 is followed by a section that centers on the dominant key D, which leads to G major at the end of the cadenza. This kind of harmonic exploration supports what Richard Kramer refers to as the radical tonal deflection that Beethoven employs in his cadenzas. Indeed, Beethoven pushes the harmonic envelope in many of his middle and late period works. Even the movement itself has strong and radical harmonic movement. Take the presence of C sharp minor, for example, in the movement itself. It seems, though, that in the cadenzas, Beethoven saw an opportunity to push the harmonic boundaries even further and faster. Thus, the improvisatory nature of the cadenza gave Beethoven the free space for radical experimentation that fixed conventions of form would not allow in the movements proper. There's evidence throughout Beethoven's output that he experimented with the final trill area, the last section of a cadenza immediately preceding the re-entry of the orchestra. The established classical protocol was for the piano to trill and then for the orchestra to immediately enter in a tutti fashion, driving directly toward the end of the movement. Beethoven was bent on toying with this expectation, both by delaying the gratifying re-entry and altering the established roles of soloist and orchestra. Beethoven composed 3 cadenzas for the first movement of his piano concerto opus number 1, opus 15 in C major. The third cadenza includes a witty and effective gesture that denies the expected resolution. By the end of the long cadenza, the dominant key of G has been firmly established and the soloist seems to be rapidly concluding his or her escapade. After a flurry of 16th notes, Beethoven places a predictable G7 chord to signal the conclusion of the cadenza. This chord is followed by another G7 chord, this time at a softer volume, which then gives way to a pregnant silence. After this, the orchestra finally re-enters and closes the movement out, but not before Beethoven executes this simple yet effective altering of expectations that is evident at the end of so many of his cadenzas. Such a trickster. All right. So that's an example of how he tries to play with audience expectations. The first cadenza for the first movement of Opus 58 that we just listened to contains that we listened to in its entirety just a minute ago, contains multiple gestures that confound expectations. As I mentioned earlier, this cadenza seems to be driving towards a cadence in G minor. The final trill is between A and B flat before the 11th hour change to B natural that suggests G major. So you'll see here, yeah, you can actually see it here on the trill, that right above it, there's a little flat showing that A should trill up to B flat. And then finally down here, there's that little natural that shows that at the very, very end, it goes to B natural, A to B natural instead. In this sense, Beethoven plays with the tonal expectations of the audience. This gesture, though, is only the beginning of Beethoven's radical rethinking of the final trill area. After the switch to the B natural, the trill continues to suggest a strong tutti re-entry in G major, but strikingly, the orchestra comes in softly and continues to accompany as the piano plays the Dolce theme. This gives the sense that the cadenza actually continues through the reentry of the orchestra and perhaps even to the end of the movement. This gesture is radically different than the concertos that came before it and provides an interesting element to the overall narrative context of the movement. Here we go. So I think the main things to listen for here are just the trill changing from what's sounding like it's going to move towards G minor to stay in G minor, and then finally moving towards G major. Plantinga describes the music in this movement as a conversation, indeed a struggle between the soloist and orchestra, the piano representing, quote, tranquil and nuanced reflection, and the orchestra portraying, quote, energetic motion and direct action. It is after the cadenza that the soloist finally wins, quote, wins, and convinces the orchestra to adopt its point of view. Indeed, the orchestra re-enters as a docile accompaniment to the piano in the very spot where the orchestra would usually take a commanding role. The piano, quote, successfully imposes its version and takes control of the codetta, all typically at levels of piano and pianissimo, and allows itself only a few measures, celebration, and a surging crescendo of passage work at the very close. Furthermore, it is the improvisatory cadenza that gives the piano its final victory in the battle, perhaps showing that Beethoven saw the cadenza as a powerful, if not transformational, moment in the work. So what does this all tell us? Beethoven's written cadenzas for his piano concertos can give modern listeners a sense of his improvisation. He used, developed, and manipulated themes from the movement in his improvisations. He explored adventurous harmonic motion. He played with audience expectations. By looking at Beethoven's written cadenzas, one gets a glimpse of his improvisatory style. It is a highly organized process where he recalls themes from the movement at hand, experiments with radical tonal areas, and jars audience expectations. Beethoven's improvisatory techniques also informed his composed works. Indeed, the opening section of the finale of the Ninth Symphony features the same technique of revisiting themes from earlier in the work. The method of recapping themes in an improvisatory section wasn't revolutionary at the time. The technique is actually quite similar to Mozart's. In other ways, though, Beethoven pushed the boundaries of classicism, and his improvisations no doubt reflected that. The material in his written cadenzas moves into remote keys that are not present in the movement, showing his penchant for harmonic experimentation. In the area of the final trill, Beethoven further plays with audience expectations by delaying the resolution. These aspects suggest that the improvised cadenza was Beethoven's opportunity to experiment in a way he felt would be unacceptable, perhaps, in the composed movement. Perhaps the most important point here, though, is not that Beethoven's improvisations were revolutionary. In certain aspects, they were revolutionary, but rather that he was part of a continuum within what we would recognize as the classical performance world, where improvisation held a central and important place for several centuries. It is indeed ironic that a great improviser like Beethoven would play such a large role in leading to the demise of the practice by mid-century. The beginning of the end can surely be traced to the notating of his cadenzas in 1809. As Beethoven's reputation as the genius composer became more established, interpreters became less likely to create their own improvisations. Throughout the years, performers have written their own cadenzas to Beethoven's concertos, but the notion that he or she would improvise a passage within the great composer's work seems to be at odds with the tenets of the current Western art music tradition. This is a lesson for us in our modern day world of music education, where classical and improvised musics, usually jazz, are often viewed as occupying opposite silos that have little in common. I suggest that a more accurate view, one that honors the actual history of improvisation in relation to composed music up through the mid-19th century, is that they are more closely related, and that if we are to truly honor the composers that are considered great masters today, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, we need to recognize, celebrate, and further investigate the important role that improvisation had in their lives and creative output. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, thanks to all of you. I see some of you now on Zoom. Thanks, Wajen. I see that. So I'll take a few questions if anybody wants to ask anything.
I wanted to mention that so much of this written out improvisation is so in the late sonatas, opus 109, 110, 111, you know, it's so written out improvisation in so many aspects. And it must have been such a tedious exercise to write it all out. I don't know how he did it.
Well, and absolutely, and especially at that point, he couldn't hear anymore, so it was even more tedious than we can possibly imagine. But you're absolutely right, and those later sonatas, those aren't the latest, but well, so those are getting towards when he couldn't hear anymore. I don't remember the dates on those. 109, 110, 111. I don't remember, but
they're at the end of his life.
Yeah, there's okay, yes, right. So anyway, but yes, it's absolutely tedious to write out all these improvisations. But what you're saying, it totally just points to the fact that improvisation was just really critical to his compositional process too, which I didn't really even talk about much, but anyway. But yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I recently read a new biography of Beethoven, and this man talked an awful lot about how he argued with his publishers because he kept asking them to revise things. They would just come back and come back and come back, and the publishers would just sort of throw up their hands.
Yeah. So I don't know if you can all hear Virginia, but she said that in a recent biography of Beethoven, they talk about how he kept angering his publishers by always asking to revise his already published works, always wanting to change it. Yeah, that's great.
Other questions for Brian? Holly? No?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wait, we have one. Yeah, go ahead.
If we weren't studying this, if you weren't telling us about this now, there'd be no way for me to know how much improvisation there was in this piece. I mean, how is it all notated on the score? Like you said, you showed us a couple of examples where there's just, one section it says, does it just say improvise something or?
Yeah, so it's just all in the score. It just shows there's just the big fermata. Okay, but then there's separate. So like I can show you. I actually think I have them up. So like here, like this is just a PDF of it, but here's like piano, like, so they are written here. Oh, you can't see it. Sorry. I thought I stopped sharing my screen. Why is that not? Oh, I see why. End show. Show is over. Show is now over. So here, so here's the like the actual notation of them. So like, I guess the idea is, I mean, I don't know if anybody, it's possible that some folks here have performed these pieces. I'm not sure. Yeah, have you performed this one? Number 4. Which cadenza did you play?
The first one.
The first one.
In fact, I wasn't even aware of the second one. To say.
Well, I think, to me, it makes sense. This one, it's like, first of all, it's beautiful, but it brings in the themes from the movement in a really satisfying way. And then the Dolce theme that it ends with, that then the orchestra supports the piano with afterwards, it's right there. So it seems like it's not coming out of nowhere like it does in the other one. So, but yeah, so I guess ostensibly, I mean, maybe you had the whole thing memorized when you performed it. Did you? Yeah. So it would this one would be inserted, or the other one would be inserted, or if somebody was really feeling saucy, they could improvise in there.
Well, in my edition of it, they had the cadenza in the very back.
Okay, it was okay.
Few pages. of
Okay.
the Score.
You still had to flip to the back to get to it, but yeah, but it was there. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good. Which edition is it? One of
I use Shermer.
the Shermer. Okay, cool. Yeah, because I was actually looking, wondering which which ones had them published in there. It makes sense to have them in there. Cool. Yeah. No, right. So does that answer the question about?
Yeah, because I would never have known.
Yeah.
I mean, as many times as I've heard these things, I've never would have known about that without studying the individual kind of thing. Now, did you do all this research yourself? This is all your work?
Yeah, this is my work. I mean, it's
That's tedious to me.
yeah. So this
Beautiful, it's beautiful though. It really, I'll never hear it the same again. I mean, no, it'll be very different hearing when you have these things pointed out. Then it just, all of a sudden, it's all there that you didn't, it's like doors open that you didn't know were closed.
Yeah, no, for sure. And thank you. And I'm glad. And so this research, just the background on it, I started this research when I was at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign when I was working on my doctorate. And I took, so even though my degree is in jazz, I took a lot of like traditional musicology while I was there. It was my secondary concentration. And I had an opportunity to study with William Kinderman, who I quoted in here, who has written a biography of Beethoven and performs all these works and, you know, is in residence in Germany. And so he was actually an expert in this area, which I was also interested in. And so I used that opportunity to learn a lot from him. And so I wrote a paper for that course and started this presentation. And then 10 years, 12 years later, reopened. It was like sort of reopening the patient kind of, and then did a bunch more research on it. So, but yeah, it was a long process, but I just find this stuff so interesting that I really enjoy doing it. Okay.
Polly has her hands up.
Okay, great. Polly, please.
Yeah, you mentioned the Ninth Symphony,
Yeah.
and I'm thinking it was maybe the late 80s, early 90s when CD-ROMs first came out. I was in Vienna, and I'd seen a review of the analysis of the Ninth Symphony. I think the guy was Winter, and I couldn't buy it in the United States, but I saw it in a music store in Vienna. It was like over $100, but it was fascinating, absolutely fascinating how he took apart everything and you really understood the Ninth Symphony. It was genius. I've moved recently and I don't know where, I may have donated that to Converse because I gave a lot of stuff to the Converse Music Library, but I think the name was Winter, but it was an American musicologist, and it was absolutely incredibly interesting. He was just taking apart from the notebooks, because some of those themes for the Ninth Symphony were in notebooks that were years before. So I think your presentation was A1.
Thanks. I appreciate that. And that's really interesting. I'd like to see that
First thing-
analysis. What's that?
Theme, A1 is a theme, right?
All right,
You got it.
A1, got it, Polly.
You
got it.
got
Oh, yeah, it's good. Yeah. Nice.
Not too subtle.
Thank you.
There are also a lot of scores at the Morgan Museum in New York.
Mm,
A lot of, I don't know if you can actually go and see them anymore, but years ago when I went there,
Yeah.
you could go into a room, a darkened room, and see original Beethoven and Bach scores.
the scores, yeah.
Right there, you know, in glass cases. I would imagine today that it's all closed up. You'd have to make an appointment or be a, you know, musicologist or, you know,
Yeah.
you'd
Well,
have to- but to be able to see that handwriting. is
oh, it's incredible. Yeah. And a lot of that stuff's online now, actually, too. So his sketchbook, so
sure.
Beethoven's sketchbooks are a huge thing. And there is, I mean, and so when I was doing this research, I didn't really include any of it, but yeah, there are certain pages from his notebooks where he has sketched out stuff that looks sort of like chord changes, you know, like kind of like jazz chord changes.
Right.
And so I was, so there's a lot there. It's amazing to, you know, it's so tragic that, you know, I mean, so tragic the way that it happened with him with his hearing, but he was so much of his life is documented and so many of his ideas are documented through those sketchbooks that we actually have this amazing record of like what he did. Yeah.
The iPhone is Stephanie.
Okay, Stephanie, please.
Hi, Brian. That was a fabulous talk this morning. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I had a couple of questions. I had just one, and then I thought, well, while he's here, I'm going to ask him the other one. And you may not know about it, especially the one about Bach. But the question is, when you say that he composed through improvisation, I'm wondering, I do some composing myself, and I think I can't imagine any other way, but I don't know if he did it the way I do it. And I wondered if you had, any clue what that process may have looked like. And the second question, I'm just going to give them both to you because I don't want to use too much time. The other one is when I was at Eastman, we worked on the unaccompanied violin partitas and sonatas, and we had a copy of what his handwriting looked like in his music. And when I look at it, there's all these curvy lines.
Yeah.
And the 30 seconds and the 60.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you agree with my hunch that some of these curvy lines and the way he wrote the music, visually, how it looks, if that was one of the clues. I went to a talk about Bach's improvisation. I went to school right around the time that we were going from old school Baroque playing to what we hear right now. So I was wondering what you thought about the way the penmanship looks, or if that was just the style in Baroque and everybody did it. Do you happen to know that?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. And I don't know for sure, but that so to address the second question first, I tend to agree with that. Looking at I've looked at some of Bach's stuff. I've certainly looked at a lot of Beethoven stuff, but I feel like if you look at those original pages, they do look very artistic. They're almost like works of art, visual art unto themselves, right? There's just all this stuff happening and stuff moving around. It's so different than the very kind of sterile printed music that we see today. It's almost like it was alive, and it really kind of was alive in their minds while they were writing it. So yeah, I do tend to agree with that. I don't have, you might have more information on it than I do, but it's certainly, I think so. I think that was my impression. My impression when I have looked at those things is that thing exactly, that there's like something to the lines and there's some kind of that's part of the composition itself, and then it's all that stuff gets taken out when we get our more sterilized versions of them.
I can give you an image on that real quick. I just realized I have it handy.
Okay, sure. Oh yeah, look at that. Yeah. Oh, look at that. That's amazing. Can you guys see it? Here, wait, hold on.
Talk.
Here we go.
Stephanie, talk while you're.
I got it. I got there.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't think I need.
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah, it's so artistic. Look at that. Yeah, it's incredibly. And so I don't know if the actual curve, the thing that's barring together those 64th notes or whatever those are, sometimes they're curved. I mean, could that have had meaning? Maybe. I'm not sure. It's hard to know that, but it's beautiful though. Gosh, look at that. That's really cool. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, I know, right? Right. No, that's cool. And then in terms of the process, in terms of your first question, the compositional process related to the improvisation, I don't know. And like you said, it's hard to imagine. I mean, for me as well, it's hard to imagine composition without improvisation. But I mean, my recollection is that the idea is that he would just sit down and just play until he found something he liked, and then take that idea and roll with it. That is what I remember, but it's also, there's more about the process that people have done research into that's what I'm remembering at this point. But
he took his sketchbooks with him wherever he took his walks and whatnot, and he would hear something in his head and write it down.
He always had those sketchbooks, but so I think that maybe those were two different, because with the sketchbooks, he would have had the idea, I guess it was improvised in his mind or whatever, but he also had these times when he just would sit down and just improvise at the pianoforte, I guess it was at the time. Yeah. So I'm not sure if I'm providing any new information, but basically just like, yes, I agree, about all that. And yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. You're welcome. any final questions?
Well, we surely have enjoyed this morning. And actually, I do have a final question or a request.
Sure.
Could you tell us a little bit about, because some of us at the board meeting heard about some of the changes at UNC Asheville's music department. And I was hoping that you could share some of them with, not everyone here was at that meeting. So.
Some of the changes.
Like your new.
Are you referring? I was thinking you might be referring to one in particular. Yeah. So we do have a brand new Steinway Model D concert grand piano that is on the stage. We got it in September. It was the product of an extremely generous donation that we have been working on for a very, 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 very long time. But it is an absolutely beautiful piano. I don't know if you know the background on it, but I know you all know Bill Bears, but the two of us went up to, New York. We went up to the factory and had the opportunity to select from 7 different pianos. We went into the room, the two of us, with a bunch of Steinway people, and played through these 7 pianos. And we saw something I'll never forget. It was unbelievable. And so we ended up selecting this one that we have on the stage, and it's an amazing instrument. And I look forward to y'all being able to check it out. I did talk to Bill about it. I actually need to go to a gig right after this. And so unfortunately I can't do it right now, but like maybe work with Bill or with me, but I know that, Bill attends meetings and stuff like that. So work with him to try to get in there, but we certainly would love for you guys to go in and check it out. And I mean, it's really, really remarkable instrument.
Oh, that's wonderful. And also I understand there are changes in the piano department in terms of what's happened with Huajin.
Indeed, yes. So in the fall, we're super excited. Huajin is going to be joining us as a full-time lecturer in music. Yeah. So we're super, super, super excited about that. I don't know if Huajin is still here. It doesn't look like she's still here, but yeah, no, it's really, really wonderful. And Huajin has been teaching here for quite a while, and just has been doing amazing work. And so we're just thrilled. So starting in the fall, she'll be on full time, and hopefully, there's all kinds of like, I'm hoping that I can, so I'm the chair, so it's like a lot of my responsibility, but I'm hoping that we can keep it going into the future, but this fall she's going to be starting full time. Yeah. Well,
it sounds great. And I know that you have new programs using the piano being planned as well. And we're looking forward to maybe being a little part of that too.
We would love that. We would love that for sure.
Well, thank you so very much. And I'll be getting your address and things because I need to get the mail off to you. But
okay. A check. Okay, that was code for check. Yeah, no, I can send you my address here.
All right, I want to say one thing.
Hey, wait, we got one more comment. Hold on. Yeah.
We need another presentation from you on the Grateful Dead and that there are a lot of us that would love that.
Okay, that can be arranged. Anyway, I'm teaching my Beatles class this fall, and then the Grateful Dead class in the spring. And but yeah. Yeah, but I'd be happy to. Thanks. Yeah.
My 2 favorite bands. I mean, the Beatles were just extraordinary.
Yeah. No, they are extraordinary. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you again, and I guess we will adjourn till another occasion, everybody. Yes.
Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate it. Really, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your questions.
Sure thing. Bye-bye.